Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. This video is part of a series of videos where I'll be going over the basic syntax of different programming languages. Now, one of the most annoying things about picking up a new programming language is having to learn all the syntax from scratch. In my own experience, it generally manifests in a lot of Google searching and Stack Overflow. For an experienced developer, the problem isn't understanding the concepts of programming, it's knowing how to implement those concepts in the new language. So things like variables, data types, data structures, loops, conditionals, and object orientation. All of these things are done a little bit differently in each programming language, and having to research how to do it all can be extremely annoying and tedious. In this video, I'll go through and show you the basic syntax for the most common parts of the language. I'll give you a brief history of the language, and we'll touch on some of the best practices and conventions used in that language. Now, this is meant to be a quick run-through. I won't be showing you how to install or configure anything, and we won't really have time to learn how to do everything. You see, I've distilled it down into what I consider the core concepts, so the goal for this is to be a quick video, so I can't cover every aspect of the language. With that being said, this video is meant for programmers who already understand the core concepts of programming. It's not going to teach you any programming concepts. I'll simply show you how to do all the common things in the new language. So if you are new to programming, Draft Academy has hundreds of videos where I hold your hand and I walk you through everything you need to learn to program, but this is meant for developers who already understand programming. So without further ado, let's get started. PHP is a server-side scripting language designed primarily for use on web servers, but also used as a general-purpose programming language. PHP was created in the 1990s by Rasmus Lerdorf and is fully object-oriented. Most common use cases for PHP is in web development. Because PHP can be written alongside HTML, and also because it integrates so well with HTML and other web technologies, you'll often find it running on a web server. PHP began as a set of rudimentary C programs designed to help its founder maintain his website's homepage, but soon snowballed into a fully fledged language in 1997. Generally, PHP code is run using an interpreter which sits on the web server. Once the PHP code is executed, a finished web page is then sent to the user. This process allows for the creation of dynamic web pages, meaning aspects of the website can change dynamically depending on the result of executing the PHP code. Most popular PHP interpreter is completely free and can be deployed on most web servers and operating systems. Because it's free and portable, PHP has become a staple in the web development world. PHP utilizes a garbage collector, and its syntax is based on C and C++. Many developers choose to write PHP using a basic text editor. Generally, PHP will be written in the same environment as the HTML and front-end technologies that it interacts with. Although several special IDEs have been developed, some of the most popular include NetBeans, PHP Storm, and Adobe Dreamweaver. So let's get started. I'm going to show you guys a lot of the most common things that you'll be doing in PHP. You know, a lot of the stuff that you do in other programming languages, I'll show you how to do them in PHP, and it'll just kind of give you an overview of the language and kind of give you an idea of how PHP works. So let's get started. First thing I want to do is talk to you guys briefly about how PHP works in general. So over here I have my text editor, and you'll notice that I have a PHP file. It's just called site.php. And then over here I have my web browser, and there's actually a third component that we need, which is a web server. So PHP generally is run using a web server, and that's how I'm going to be using it today. So I'm going to be using PHP to essentially build a website. So over here in my command line, I have PHP already installed on my computer, and I can just run this command, PHP -S localhost 4000. And this is just, it'll be a basic web server that's sort of built into the PHP language that we can use. This isn't a production web server, but I can use it just, to kind of test out my different PHP stuff. So I can run this, and you'll see that I'm running it on localhost port 4000, and it'll give me my document root. So all I have to do now is go over to my web browser, localhost 4000, and so now I'm on localhost 4000 /site.php, and this web page is linked up to this PHP file. So that's basically how it's set up. So the first thing we need to do when we want to write our PHP is inside of our PHP file, we need to write out PHP tags. So I can go over here and write out $! question mark PHP, and then I can write out a question mark and then another greater than sign. And then inside of these tags, anything that we write is going to be rendered as PHP. So over here, now we have some valid PHP. If I refresh my page, whatever changes we make should show up. So let me show you guys some cool code that we can put inside of these tags. First thing I want to show you guys is printing. So over here, I have an example of how we can print stuff out onto the screen. So generally in PHP, when we print something, we're going to be printing it out into the HTML document. There's a couple different ways I can do this. One way is just by using this echo command. So I can say echo, and then inside of quotation marks, I can just put whatever I want to echo out into the HTML. So you'll see over here, I'm actually echoing out valid HTML. So I'm echoing out h1, hello world, and then a closing tag. And that's actually showing up over here on the document. So you can use echo. You can also use this print command, and print is going to do the same exact thing as echo. It's essentially the same command, except print is actually going to have a return value of 1. So sometimes if you want a print statement that will return a value, you can use this. And then, like I said before, you can also use echo. So I'm actually using these PHP commands to modify the HTML file. And all of this is happening, like I said, on the web server. So in addition to printing, we can also get into variables. Now, variables are extremely useful. Obviously, a variable is a way that we can store a specific piece of information and use it and modify it. So variable names are case sensitive and must start with the $sign and then a letter or an underscore. And after the letter or the underscore, they can have letters, numbers, or underscores. So convention says to start with a lowercase word and then additional words are capitalized. So for example, my first variable, just like that. That's generally the convention in PHP. And then over here, you can see I have these variables. So again, anytime you're accessing or referencing or creating a variable, always need to start with that $sign. So over here, PHP is a dynamically typed language, so you don't have to like specify the types, but I will show you guys the different types we can work with. So over here, we have a string, which is just using these quotation marks. We have an integer, so this is just like a whole number, a decimal, which is just a decimal number. You also hear this being referred to as floating point numbers. Then we have a Boolean, so it can either be true or false. And you'll see down here, we can modify a variable. So I could say like name is equal to John. So I'm changing the value of the name variable. And then over here, if I want to print out a variable, I can just come down here and I can interweave the variable in with a string. So I could say like your name is $sign, and then this is automatically going to place the variable in there. I actually love that it does this. That's pretty cool. And over here, you can see we print out your name is John. All right, now one thing I will say about variables in PHP, I know I said over here that convention says that we're using this like camel case, so start with the lowercase word and then additional words are capitalized. The thing about PHP is there isn't necessarily like a hard and fast convention for this. You'll see people using camel case, so the first word will be lowercase and then additional words are uppercase. But you'll also see people using underscores, so underscore would be like my underscore first underscore variable. Really, it seems like it varies depending on the PHP framework that you're using. Really, the idea is just pick one and stick with it. Throughout this video, I'll be using underscores and I'll be using camel case just to kind of show you guys the different ways that we can do it. But for the most part, PHP doesn't necessarily have like a hard and fast standard. It's going to be more of like what you prefer. So now I want to show you guys how we can convert different data types. So I can cast or convert one data type to another. So down here, I'm just echoing out. So I have a floating point number here. So it's 3.14. I can cast it to an integer just by placing int inside of these parentheses and then right after specifying the floating point number. So you can see over here, this prints out as just 3. So it got casted into an integer. I can do the same thing for a string. So over here, I have a string with an integer trapped inside of it. So I could just put int over there. I could do the same thing with float. So over here, float, same thing for this floating point number. You can see I'm able to add those together so we get 140.5. You can also do it with a function. So I could say int val, and then inside of the parentheses, I can pass in the string. Same thing for float val. So those are just a couple different ways that you can convert different types. Now I want to talk to you guys about strings. So strings are one of the most common data types that you work with in any programming language, and PHP is no exception. So over here I have a string variable called greeting, just set it equal to hello. First thing I'll show you guys is how strings get indexes. So string indexes are the same as in every other language. Starts off at 0. So even though H is the first character in the string, it's technically at index position 0. So there's 5 characters in this string, but the last character is at index position 4 because we start counting at 0. And over here we have a couple different functions. So strlen stands for string length, and in here we can pass in our string, and what this is doing is it's printing out a 5 over here. And you'll notice I'm printing this out and then I say .br, so that's basically just allowing me to print it out on different lines. That's not really significant, but you're going to see that throughout this tutorial. And down here, if I want to access a specific character inside of a string, I can access it using its index. So I can just say the name of the string or the string itself. open and close square brackets, and then the index of the character that I want to access. So greeting 0 is going to give me H, that capital H. You can also access elements from the back of the string. So I could say greeting -1, and this is going to give me that 0. So starting from the back, it's like -1, -2, -3, etc. That's pretty common in other dynamically typed languages. You can also do a string replace. So there's this str_replace function. And over here, I'm going to pass in the character that I want to replace inside the string, what I want to replace it with, and then the string that I want to do the replacing in. So you see over here, I replaced all the L's with capital Z's, so I get hezo instead of hello. And finally, there's one more I want to show you guys, which is strchr, so string character. What this will do is it will find this string or this substring inside a string and then return the rest of the string. So over here, it's finding that LLO, and then it's just returning from there to the end of the string. So that's pretty useful. Obviously, there's more of these string functions that you can find online, but this is just kind of an introduction and giving you guys an idea of how these work. In addition to strings, we can also work with numbers. So numbers, obviously another very useful data type. So over here, I just have some basic stuff we do with numbers. So over here, I'm multiplying two numbers, 2 times 3. You can see we get 6. I can also add, subtract, and divide numbers. Over here, I can say 2 * 3. That's going to give me exponential. So this is going to be 2 raised to the 3rd power. So you see over here, we get 8. I can do the modulus operator. So the modulus operator is going to take 2 numbers, divide them, and then spit out the remainder. So I can say 10 mod 3. And what this is going to do is going to take 10 divided by 3 and give us the remainder. So over here, we get 1. I can also specify order of operations. So over here, I have this math equation, 1 + 2 × 3. By default, PHP is going to do the multiplication first. So it's going to be 3 times 2, which is 6, plus 1 is 7. But if I want, I could place parentheses around the 1 + 2, and now it'll do that first. So when I run the program again, we get 9. 1 + 2 is 3 times 3 is 9. I also want to show you guys how ints and doubles interact. So this tends to be different for different programming languages. So over here, I have a whole number, and then I have a decimal number, and you'll see we get a decimal number back. If I was to convert this guy to a whole number though, so if I did it 10 divided by 3, both integers, you'll see that we also get a floating point number back. So certain languages, when you do 2 ints together, you always get an int back. PHP, that's not the case. Over here, I have a variable num. I set it equal to 10. I can say num plus equals 100. What that's going to do is it's going to take num and it's going to add 100 to it, and it'll store that back in the num variable. So now you see over here, when we print out num, we get 110. I could also increment nums with this ++ operator. You see over here, we get 111 because I incremented it. And then finally down here, we have some useful math functions or methods. So I can say like max, and this will give me the maximum of the 2 numbers. You see we get 3 back. I could do square root of 144, we get 12 back, and then I could round 2.7 and we get 3 back. So, just like in any other programming language, there's all the standard math functions that you would expect, but those are just a few so you can see how they work. Now I want to talk to you guys about a very important concept in PHP, which is getting input from the user. Now, one thing I do want to show you guys is in a PHP file, we can actually put HTML alongside of our PHP code. So over here, I have my little PHP tags, but outside of these tags, I can specify HTML. So you can write out an entire HTML document and just intersperse little blocks of PHP throughout, and that's usually what people do. So over here, I have an HTML form, and generally a form is how our PHP is going to interact with our HTML. So generally the form is going to be the interface for the PHP on the web server to interact with the client HTML. And so over here, this form needs a couple attributes. So the first attribute that we need to define is action, and this should be equal to the file. So over here, I have this as app.php, but I want to change this to site.php because site.php is the name of the file that we're currently using. So essentially, this is going to be the name of the file where you want to handle the information that gets passed from this form. And then finally over here, we have this method, and I just have this set to get. There's 2 methods that we're going to talk about. The first is get, the second is post. I'm going to show you guys what they both do. But in this section, we're going to be looking at get. And then finally down here, I have an input. So you need to use an input tag. And I have the type equal to text, and you always want to give this a name, so I give this a name of username. You can see over here on the web browser, I have my little text box. So what I could do is I could enter in my name, and then when I click enter, you'll see my name gets printed down here. So what's happening is when I click enter, that's me submitting the form, and when the form gets submitted, what happens is PHP is going to be able to get that information. So I can use this get function or this little get variable over here. So I can say $_get, and then inside of these square brackets, specify the name of the input that I want to get. So over here, remember I had name over here on this input tag, so that's going to match what I have over here. And what that'll do is it'll print out whatever name that I entered. So you can see over here, the name that I entered is getting printed out. If I change this to like Tom, you'll see that that's getting printed out over here as well. And that's basically what happens. So I can set up a form, set up some inputs. As long as I give them names, I can then access whatever got input from my PHP. I also want to show you guys one cool thing with get, what we're actually doing. So when I'm using this get method, what I'm doing is I'm storing all of these values up inside of the URL. So you'll see over here on my webpage, it's localhost 4000/site.php, but then I have this question mark and it says username is equal to Tom. So that value, in other words, the value that got submitted is actually being stored up here in the URL. So if I change this, like if I change it to Kate, you'll see that it updates down here on my page. So the PHP is actually using those URL parameters to get this information. So what I could do now is I could store information in the URL. So I could change that. I could also add in other information. So over here I could put an ampersand, and that basically means that I'm going to specify another variable. And over here I could say like age is equal to 70. So if I said age is equal to 70 and I entered, you'll see this is showing up down here. That's because in my PHP, I said this variable age is equal to get age, and then I echoed it out. So I was actually able to get a value that was passed into the URL from inside of my PHP using this get command right there. So that's pretty useful. And that's really useful for storing information in a URL. A lot of websites will do this. They'll store information inside the URL. That way you can bookmark certain pages and you can have all that information stored in the bookmark in the URL. So that's one way that we can get input from the user. I want to show you guys another way. All right, so I went ahead and set up another way that we can do this. So get is, like I said, it's storing everything up in the URL, but in certain circumstances, you're not going to want to store the information that gets input into the URL. For example, if you have something like a password or something that's more secure. So what we can actually do is we can use what's called the post method. So over here, instead of saying get, I said post. Everything else is still the same. I still have this username set up. And then over here, instead of saying $_get, I'm saying $_post. And post is a more secure way for us to pass this information. So if I typed in my name up here, you'll see that the name still shows up down here, but it didn't show up inside the URL. That's because it got passed more securely, didn't get passed through the URL. But everything else is the same. So I can do exactly what I did with get down here using post. It's just that it won't show up in the URL. So sometimes you want that information to be stored in the URL, like I said, for bookmarks or other things, but a lot of times you don't want that information to be stored in the URL, in which case you can use post. But those are the main two ways that you can get information from the client. Now I want to talk to you guys about lists in PHP. So for all intents and purposes, a list is basically just an array. It's a structure where I can store, multiple pieces of information. So over here I have this lucky numbers list, and I'm just inside of these open and close square brackets, I'm giving it some value. So like 4, 8. So you can swap the data type. So I can have multiple data types in the same list. So I have like a string here. I have a decimal number over there. And you'll see the indexes over here are 0 through 5. So indexes are just like string indexes. In fact, strings and arrays are pretty much treated exactly the same way. So over here, the first element is at index position 0, second at 1, etc. If I want to access a specific element, I can just go ahead and access it by specifying the name of the list and then the index that I want to access. So in this case, I'm accessing this 4. I'm setting it equal to 90. Down here, I can print these out. So I'm saying lucky numbers 0 prints out 90. Lucky numbers 1 prints out 8. And then if I want to get the count, I can say count. And then inside of these parentheses, pass in the structure that I want to get the count from. In our case, it's lucky numbers, so it'll tell me how many elements are inside of there. So there's also a couple other ways that we can create these lists. I have a couple over here. So over here, it's just I'm saying array, and then inside of parentheses, I'm passing all of these in as arguments. You can see it gives us the same output. It's doing the same exact thing. It's just another way of doing it. And then over here, if I don't know what I want inside the list initially, I can just create an empty one right there. And you can see if I try to print out an element that's not inside the list, it's just going to be blank. So that's kind of how all that works. In addition to one-dimensional lists, we can also have n-dimensional lists, so like 2, 3, 4, 5-dimensional lists. So over here, I just have a simple 2-dimensional list to kind of show you guys how this works. So number grid, and inside of these square brackets, I have some more square brackets. So it's basically just lists within lists, and I can access them like this. So this first number will represent the overall element, and then the second number will represent the element inside of the element. So over here, I'm setting 0, 1 to 99, printing out 0, 0. We get that 1, printing out 0, 1, we get 99. So this same, formula can be used for 3 or 4 or 5 dimensions, doesn't really matter. So now I want to show you guys some different functions that we can use with these lists, and basically just introduce you guys to list functions. So over here I have an empty list. I could say array push. So this is like a function, and then inside of these parentheses, pass in the array where I want to push the elements, and then I could pass in all the elements that I want to push. So over here I'm pushing Oscar and then Angela, and then over here I'm pushing Kevin into the list. And that's kind of useful. And then over here, what I can do is I can actually like print out the specific elements. So I could echo out like friends 0, friends 1, and then friends 2. So I'm echoing out the contents of the list. I could also use this sort methods or sort function. So I can say sort friends. Then over here, it's basically going to sort them. So it sorts them alphabetically because they're all strings. I can also check to see if an element is inside of the array. So I can echo out like in array Oscar and then tell them the name of the array. And you'll see we get a 1 over here. So this isn't actually the index. That is true or false. So if I was to print out, if I was to echo out true, you'll see over here that it echoes out a 1. If I was to echo out false, it doesn't echo anything. So 1 and then nothing is like how you would print out arrays in PHP. So that's basically what we're getting here, so you're not confused. So this isn't actually an index position, it's just true or false. We can also represent associative arrays. So associative array would be like a dictionary. It's basically a structure where we're storing key value pairs. So it's basically the same as an array, but instead of storing individual elements, we're storing key value pairs. So over here I have one called test grades, and I just set it equal to array, and then inside of these parentheses I have the key, and it gets mapped to a value. So Andy would be the key and B plus would be the value. This is just like a dictionary of test grades. So Stanley gets mapped to a C, Ryan gets an A. And then you can use strings. You can also use numbers as keys. So 3 would be a key, and then I map it to like 95.2. So over here I'm just printing out so test grades, and then inside of these square brackets I could place the key. So I'm passing the key in, and it'll give me the value back. So if I pass in Andy, I get a B plus back. And I could also pass in this 3 as a key, and it'll give me 95.2 back. It's important to notice that this isn't an index. This is actually a key. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now I want to show you guys how we can use functions in PHP. So functions are, it's basically just a block of code that can be reused throughout our program. So over here I can just say function, the name of the function, and then over here I can just specify some parameters. So this function's taking in num1 and num2. And then down here I have a variable called sum, and then you'll see that this function is returning num1 plus num2. So this return keyword will break us out of the function, and it'll also return a value back to the caller that we specify right next to it. So over here I have this variable sum, and I set it equal to add numbers for 3, and then I'm printing it out. You can see over here we get 7 because sum gets the value that's returned from the add numbers function. We can also use optional parameters. So this is something that's pretty useful. Over here you'll see I have num2 is equal to 99. This specifies that this parameter is optional, and I'm giving it a default value. So if I left out this parameter in the add numbers function call, you'll see it's still able to execute. It's just using that default value. So since I didn't specify a value, it's going to go ahead and use the default value. So now let's go ahead and talk about if statements. So if statements is a type of conditional, basically allows us to respond to different situations in our program. Over here I have 2 Boolean variables, false and false, so is student and is smart. And I could actually write a if statement block and if else block to respond to those different variables. So here I'm saying like is student and is smart. If I wanted to check for or, I could use or logic with the 2 vertical bars just like that. And basically this operator, the and operator, allows us to check multiple conditions. I can also use an else if, so it's just else if like that. And I could say else if is student, and this exclamation point is going to be the negation operator. So that's going to negate whatever comes after it. So this is basically going to be read as not is smart. And then finally we have the else, which will get executed when none of these conditions are true. So up there I was using Boolean variables. You can also use comparisons as your conditions. So I could say if 1 is greater than 3, obviously that's false. I could say 1 less than 3, and now this will say number comparison was true. So you can use greater than, less than, greater than equals, less than equals, not equals, and double equals just like that. I could also compare strings just like I would compare any other data type. You'll see down here I'm comparing dog to cat, seeing if they're equal. So that's basically how you can use if statement conditionals in PHP. There's another type of conditional that we can use, which is called a switch statement. And a switch statement is basically a way that we can check one value against a bunch of different values. So over here, I have this my grade variable. It's equal to A. And down here, I have a switch statement. So inside the switch statement, I'm passing in this my grade value. And then what this is going to do now is it's going to allow me to respond to that. So in the case that my grade is equal to A, I could echo out you pass. And then I need this break statement here, which will break me out of the switch statement. And down here in the case that my grade is F, I'm echoing out you fail. We also have a default case, which will get executed when none of these cases are true. So if this is A right now, it's saying that I pass. If I set this to F, it's going to tell me that I failed. And if I set it to Z, which isn't a valid grade, then it's just going to say invalid grade. So that's basically how switch statements work. Now let's take a look at a while loop. So while loop's the most basic type of loop, basically a loop that will keep executing a block of code while a certain condition's true. So over here, I have this index variable, set it equal to 1. While index is less than or equal to 5, I'm going to go ahead and execute this code down here. You'll see over here we print out 1 through 5. You also want to watch out for infinite loops. So if I was to get rid of this line right here, now we have an infinite loop because index never gets incremented, so it's always going to be less than or equal to 5. So just watch out for that. We also have a do while loop, which is essentially a while loop in reverse. So instead of checking the condition first and then executing the loop body, we execute the loop body first and then check the condition. So I have the same condition as I did up there down here. But if I was to change this to 6, I'll still be able to execute one iteration of the loop. You see, I still execute this because I check the condition after I execute the loop body. There's another type of loop that we can use in PHP, which is a for loop. For loop is basically a more specialized while loop where we can specify a variable that will change or guide us through our looping process. So over here I have it basically says for, and then inside the parentheses I have the variable initialization. So I'm saying I is equal to 0. Here we have the loop guard, I is less than 5, and then we have I plus plus, and then down here it just says echo I. So I'm echoing out 0 through 4. So that's how we can do a basic for loop. And then down here we have a more specific type of for loop, which is a for each loop. It's an iterating loop. Allow us to iterate over a structure. So over here I have this array. It's very simple, just a basic list. And then I have for each, and then in here I define basically what I want to loop over for each lucky nums as lucky num. So over here, this is going to be the variable that's changing every time we go through the loop, and this is the structure that we're looping over. So I'm echoing out lucky num. You see when I refresh the page, I'm able to print out all the elements inside of that array. So for each can be pretty useful if you have a structure that you want to iterate over. So next is exception catching. There's going to be certain circumstances in your PHP code where exceptions are going to occur and you're going to want to be able to catch those. So this is basically how you can do it. I have a try catch block. Inside the try catch block, you'll see I'm actually throwing an exception. So this is how you can throw an exception. I just said throw new exception, something bad happened. So here I'm passing in a message as far as like what happened with the exception. If I wanted to catch that exception, I can come down here, catch, and this catch function is going to take as a parameter an exception. I'm just calling it E, and then down here I could print out the message. So you see over here I'm printing out something bad happened. And then we have this finally block, and any code that's in the finally block is always going to get executed no matter what. So, imagine there's a circumstance where you opened a file or you did something, and even if there's an exception, you always want to be able to close the file, or you always want to be able to do something to clean up. You can put that code down here in the finally block. It'll get executed no matter what happens. And that's basically how we can do exception catching in PHP. Now let's take a look at object orientation in PHP. So PHP is a fully object-oriented programming language, and I'm going to show you guys classes and objects, just basically how to set them up. So up here I have a class. It's the book class, and it's set up just like this. So over here I have some attributes that I'm defining. So I have 3 attributes. The first is var title, the second is public author, and the third is public static attribute. So we can either use this var keyword, or we can use a public keyword or a private keyword to define these attributes. Now the var keyword is actually more of an older way to do this. It's generally not used as much nowadays. So generally you're just going to want to say like public or private, but I just kind of threw it in there because you guys might see that. So over here I have these 3 attributes, and this one down here is static, and that means that it belongs to the class. So when a static attribute is a attribute that is at the class level, not at the object level. So that means that the static attribute will be defined on the class, and it'll be shared by all of the objects of that class. And then down here, I just have a function. It's called the readBook function. It says reading this arrow title by this arrow author. So when I use this keyword, that refers to the current object that's executing that function. So this will always refer to the current instance that's executing the function. That's pretty useful. And down here, I can create a book object. So I'm creating a variable called book1, and I'm storing a book object inside of it. So I can just say new book. And then over here, I can say book1 arrow title is equal to Harry Potter. Book1 arrow author is equal to J.K. Rowling. This is definitely one thing to keep in mind. If you're coming from another object-oriented programming language, generally you'll dereference something using the dot. But in PHP, we're going to dereference using the little arrow. So that could be a little bit confusing. I know that trips me up whenever I jump between languages. So just keep that in mind. And then over here, I'm echoing out the book's title. So we echoed out Harry Potter. I'm echoing out the static attribute. So to access a static attribute, I can just say the name of the class, 2 colons, and then the name of the static attribute. And you can see printed out my static attribute. And then if I want to call the function, I can do it just like that. So I'm calling this.title and this.author, which is going to be Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling. So that's basically how we can make classes and objects in PHP. Now let's take a look at PHP constructors. So a constructor is a special method or function that you can place inside of a PHP class, which will get called when we create an instance of that class. So over here, I have essentially the same thing that I had before. I got rid of that static attribute, and I have our constructor. So it's just function 2 underscores. So these are 2 underscores, construct, and then in here I can pass in some parameters. So I'm accepting a title and an author, and then I can just say this title is equal to title and this author is equal to author. Basically, standard constructor stuff. If you're familiar with constructors, that should make sense. And then down here, I can create a new book object. So when I create the new book object, I say new book, but over here I can pass in Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling. So when I say book, and I put the parentheses there, I'm calling this constructor, so I'm passing it some information. And then down here, we can print out the title. And then if I want, I could still modify that information. So I could say like book1 title, and that'll update the title to Half-Blood Prince. So that's all pretty obvious. And it's essentially how constructors work in every other programming language. Now let's take a look at another object-oriented programming concept. It's a design pattern, getters and setters. So getters and setters are useful in classes to control the access that a user has to the attributes of the class. So over here I have my class, and you'll notice I set the title attribute to private. So if you want to create a getter and setter for the title attribute, first we set it to private. Private basically just means that this code can only be accessed by code inside of the class. So when I set it to private, that means that only code in the book class can access it. Public would mean that anybody can access it. And then down here, you'll see that I have a get title function and a get and a set title function. So get title is just, returning the title. Set title is taking the title and then setting it. So now we have, essentially an interface that we can use for controlling access to the title. And then over here, you'll notice in the constructor, I also set the title. So when I set the title, I use that set title function. All pretty standard getter and setter stuff. And down here, I can create the object normally, but what if I want to modify it, I have to use set title and I have to use get title. So now we have, like I said, an interface for accessing that attribute. Now let's take a look at inheritance. So inheritance will allow us to have our classes inherit all the functionality from other classes. So you have a superclass, and then subclasses inherit the functionality from that superclass. Over here I have 2 classes. I have a chef class and I have an Italian chef class. The chef class has 3 functions: make chicken, make salad, and make special dish. So make chicken, it just prints out the chef makes chicken. They all kind of do the same thing. And then down here I have this Italian chef class, which extends the chef class. So basically what this means is that the Italian chef is going to inherit all the functionality from the chef class. So down here, the Italian chef has a make pasta function, and then it also has a make special dish function. So down here, I created a chef object, and I'm telling it to make chicken, and I created an Italian chef object, also telling it to make chicken. Even though the Italian chef doesn't have a make chicken function, it's still able to do it, as you can see over here, because it inherited that functionality from the superclass. And then I can also override methods. So you'll see over here, we have a make special dish function inside the chef class. Inside the Italian chef class, I'm overriding it, and I can just change it. So now if I was to call that function, so make special dish, and then down here, make special dish, and I run this program, now you'll see that the normal chef makes barbecue ribs and the Italian chef makes chicken parm. So it's pretty standard stuff. All right, now I want to talk to you guys about another concept related to inheritance, which is using constructors and attributes. So over here, I have the same setup I had before. I just have the chef class, but I actually added in some attributes. So I added in a public name and a public age, and then down here I have my constructor function. So it's taking in a name and an age, and it's just initializing both of those attributes. And then down here in the subclass, in the Italian chef class, you'll notice that I added in an extra attribute. So I have country of origin. And then here in the constructor function, I'm passing in a name, an age, and the country of origin. So down here in this constructor, I'm setting the country of origin. I'm initializing it just like that. But instead of directly initializing the name and the age, I can just call the superclass constructor to do that. So over here, I'm calling the parent. So I'm saying parent : __ construct, basically calling the parent's constructor and passing in the name and the age. That way, I leave it up to the superclass, I leave it up to the parent to initialize the name and the age, and I don't have to do that down here in the subclass. All I have to worry about is initializing the attribute that I defined on the subclass, on the Italian chef class. So then down here, same thing as before, I'm creating the chef object, I'm passing in Gordon Ramsay and 50, and then I'm creating the Italian chef object, so I'm passing in the name, the age, and then also the country of origin. And then down here, I'm just echoing out Italian chef's age. So you see we get 55. So that's basically how we can work with attributes and constructors in the superclass and the subclass. Now let's take a look at abstract classes and attributes. So an abstract class or an abstract attribute is an attribute which needs to be implemented by the subclass. So over here, I have an abstract class vehicle. And over here, I have a public abstract function move. So you'll notice that I'm not actually defining this function. I'm just kind of declaring it. I'm not actually like saying what it does. And then over here, I have a normal function, get description, and it just prints out a description of what vehicles do. So this move function needs to be implemented by subclasses. So over here, I have two subclasses, bicycle and plane. So you'll see that bicycle is going to implement this function. So it's actually defining what it does. And then the plane class does the same thing. So it's defining the move function. So really the abstract vehicle class can use the get description function, but it's going to defer to the subclasses to define the move function. And then down here, I have a plane object, and I'm telling the plane to move. So you'll see the plane, when it moves, it flies through the sky. So that's what we implemented in here. And when I say plane get description, though, it uses the description vehicles are used for transportation that it got from this vehicle class. So you can see down here, get description was defined up there in the super class. So that's basically how you can define abstract attributes and kind of work with stuff like that. So finally, I want to show you guys how we can use interfaces or interface inheritance in PHP. A lot of people will call this polymorphism. Basically, we can define an interface and then subclasses can implement that interface, and then they'll all kind of be considered as the same, type, which allows us to do special things. So over here, I have an interface animal, and an interface is basically a fully abstract class. So everything inside of it is abstract. So everything inside of it needs to be implemented. So public function speak. Obviously, I didn't define it. I just kind of gave the function stub. And then over here, I have subclasses. So instead of saying extends, when we're implementing an interface, we can just say implements. And then down here, I can just implement the speak method or the speak function because that's what had to be implemented. So the cat is going to say meow, meow. And down here, the dog is going to say woof, woof. So depending on the type of class, the type of subclass, the speak function got implemented differently. And then down here, I have an array of animals. So it just has a dog and it has a cat inside of it. And I said for each animal as animal. So each of the animals is going to speak in turn. And you'll notice that I'm able to call this speak function on both the cat and the dog because they're both using the same interface. So over here, the dog says woof woof and the cat says meow meow. So that's basically polymorphism in PHP. So that's essentially all that I wanted to cover in this video. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of like all the most common stuff that you'd be using in PHP. Hopefully kind of demystifies the language a little bit as well. Kind of gives you an idea of how everything works. And really, there's a lot more stuff that you can do in PHP. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface, but this should give you a good starting point and, a point where you can jump off of. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.